Thank you so much for having me here and hosting me. And this has been a great event so far, and I'm honored to be here. So I am the lucky person who gets to speak after lunch and lull you into your siesta. Hopefully I'll do a good job. I'm here to talk about the Lower Fraser Climate Adapt project, which is a project being done with the organization I work for called the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance. I'll just tell you a little bit about our organization. It's an organization that serves as a voice for the nations of the Lower Fraser River. And we work collaboratively to manage our fisheries and to kind of keep it sustainable for future generations. And we have 30 member nations in our alliance, stretching right from the mouth of the river to Yale First Nation. The kind of things we do is to kind of support and coordinate fisheries planning between our members, and also to do research on different fish species as well as habitat restoration. And we also have an Aboriginal knowledge project and other stuff like that. So it's been growing very rapidly in the last few years. We've just started the Climate Adapt project last year with funding through the federal government Climate Adapt Fund. The main purpose of this is to support our First Nations in planning and adapting for climate change to ensure that there's still some kind of ecosystem resiliency. The whole idea was that, with the Lower Fraser is a very highly developed region already. There's many different impacts that already, we face, from pollution, transportation, traffic, all that kind of stuff. And it's already heavily impacted the salmon that are threatened, and most of our nations have fewer fishing opportunities, every season. And it's likely to get worse as we feel the greater the impacts of climate change as well. And what we found is that in a lot of the planning processes, there's a lot of talk about impacts on infrastructure, on human development. Sorry.
Is that easier?
Yeah, maybe. Is that better for you guys? Okay. But not much. So when these planning processes going on, there's a lot of talk about how flood management and floods are going to affect infrastructure, and economic activity, but there wasn't much thinking about how it's going to impact the ecosystem and the cultural ways of being of our nations. And so we wanted to think of addressing that in some way. And so since ours is a fisheries organization, it's focused on fisheries, but since, salmon are a keystone species, it impacts we're obviously looking at the entire ecosystem as well. We're hoping to, at the end, to have a kind of First Nations developed resiliency plan that would be left to each kind of nation or nations to work together to implement as they see fit, but at least having like a common voice that can come together and discuss our concerns was the main kind of goal of this project. And we've also, part of it is including a lot of Western science. So we've developed a huge database of all the environmental values that are important for fisheries and fish species, so that it's all there together in one place for our members to access, and make decisions knowing having the data that's out there. Just a list of some of the impacts that are likely to be felt in the Lower Fraser. This is not a comprehensive list, but it's just a list of some of the main impacts that will impact our fisheries, and that we can try to do something about. So obviously coastal and inland flooding is a major threat to the lower Fraser. And it's projected that there's going to be a 1 meter rise in sea level by the end of the century. So there's an increased risk of flooding in the Fraser River, and also an increased risk of the high kind of impact flood events as was seen in the past. And so, you know, there have been some major floods on the Fraser in the past, and the frequency of those major events is likely to increase, basically, with climate change. There's also going to be, and there already is, we're seeing it already, earlier freshet and lower flows in the summer and early fall, and that the lower flows in summer impacts the spawning salmon. Higher water temperatures, which again affects fish survival and productivity, and higher landslide risk, you know, in the fish-bearing watercourses, which impacts the habitat. And also ocean acidification, and that's something that, you know, is still an unknown. There's not much we think we can kind of do to address it in terms of a local, regional, but it's something that definitely impacts salmon. And so this is just a brief outline of the process that our project will go through. In the first phase, which was last year, we kind of developed this comprehensive mapping database with inputs from our nations on what they thought were important environmental values that would impact salmon. And then we also are doing a vulnerability assessment to kind of prioritize what are the most important kind of places to look at in terms of habitat restoration. So, like, again, you know, from a First Nations perspective, the entire watershed is important, and you have to see it holistically. But given the fact that we have limited time and limited resources, you know, this is just kind of an overview of what might be the more pressing things to look at, and just an indication. So once this vulnerability assessment is ready, we're going to present it to our nations, and we have 4 different sub-regions, so we're going to have sub-regional meetings where people would kind of look at the findings and put, you know, enhance it with their own kind of inputs based on their experience and knowledge. So it's kind of a meeting of scientific as well as, you know, indigenous knowledge to come up with what the priorities would be for dealing with, you know, climate change and increasing ecosystem resilience. And then in the final year, there would be a report created, which would be just recommendations for where the nations could kind of work towards increasing ecosystem resilience. And so just a list of how this would benefit our nations. It helps us identify the risks to fish and ecosystem, creation of First Nation adaptation plans. We have developed these mapping tools as well to help us identify the most vulnerable areas. And then, you know, it'll help support the work that's already ongoing with habitat restoration. And it would, you know, if we do implement this plan, it's likely to involve a lot of habitat restoration, which again increases employment and capacity within our nations. And also it gives a voice to First Nations in planning processes. So that's really it. Thank you.